My parents invited 200 guests to my 30th birthday dinner, not to celebrate me, but to disown me publicly and dump a $400,000 debt on me. I left without a word. 4 days later, they were begging. The same people who had staged my humiliation were calling me over and over, desperate for me to stop what I had started. But in the moment itself, the first thing I noticed was not my father rising from his chair. It was not the brown envelope landing on the white tablecloth with the weight of a judge's gavel. It was not even the sound of nearly 200 forks pausing in midair. What I noticed was a young server standing near the wall with a pitcher of water in his hand. He had gone completely still, as if someone had pressed pause on him. Even a stranger understood that whatever was happening at our table was not something a person casually interrupted. My father slowly straightened his jacket with both hands. He always did that before church, before parent-teacher conferences, or before entering any room where he expected to be treated as the most important person present. I had watched that gesture thousands of times, and even at 30 years old, it still triggered the same response in me, a cold tightening in my chest and an instinctive urge to sit straighter, speak more softly, and make myself smaller. 3 decades of conditioning do not disappear simply because you have your own apartment. In a calm, carefully measured voice, my father said, "Everything we spent raising you comes to $400,000. It is time for you to pay it back." The thick, cream-colored envelope remained sealed in front of me. Then my younger sister, Ashley, reached across the table with 2 lazy fingers and picked up the car keys beside my bread plate as though she were removing a piece of trash. She was wearing the dress she had texted me about 3 days earlier, the one I had told her looked beautiful. Dangling my keys from her fingers, she said, "Dad already handled the title transfer. You do not belong here anymore." She smiled as she said it. It was not an anxious smile or the apologetic expression of someone forced into an ugly family confrontation. It was the satisfied smile of someone who had been waiting for this exact moment. I looked at the envelope, then at my keys, and finally at the 200 people seated around us. They were relatives, family friends, neighbors, and people who had known me since I was a baby. Almost every one of them found something else to look at: a plate, a glass of water, a centerpiece, the floor. Anything except my face. My mother sat at the far end of the table and never looked up. I pushed my chair back, and the legs scraped across the marble floor so loudly that the sound felt obscene in the silence. I picked up my purse and stood. No one tried to stop me. The hired music continued playing as I walked away, an expensive instrumental arrangement that had no idea what kind of scene it had been hired to accompany. I reached the parking lot before remembering that there was no longer any point in searching for my car. I called an Uber instead. For 11 minutes, I stood beneath a parking lot light in a dress I had bought specifically for my birthday and watched the small car icon move toward me on my phone. I did not cry. That was not because I was unusually strong. And it was not because I felt nothing. Some part of my body seemed to understand that tears were a form of currency, and I could not afford to spend them yet. Here is what people do not always understand about families like mine. When you grow up inside the dysfunction, it rarely feels like dysfunction. It feels like love with conditions attached. And because that is the only version you know, you simply call it love. My name is Emily Hartwell. I was 30 years old that night. I had worked for 6 years as a contracts paralegal at Delaney and Morris. I am methodical, and I am good at reading fine print. I notice inconsistencies. People in my family had often described that quality as being difficult, but over time I had learned that difficult often meant I refused to ignore what other people wanted left unexamined. My father, Richard Hartwell, had built a regional landscaping company from one truck into a business with 40 employees and a branded fleet. He had the kind of handshake that felt rehearsed because, to him, even a handshake was a performance. I could not remember ever hearing him say the words, "I was wrong." My mother, Carol, was the sort of woman who mailed birthday cards 3 weeks early and held firm opinions about decorative pillows. She had stood beside my father for 34 years, and I had never been able to decide whether she actively chose his side or had simply forgotten that other sides existed. Ashley was 28. She had always known how to use the correct tone, produce the correct smile, and shape herself into whatever the room rewarded. When we were younger, I admired that skill. Later, I understood it differently. I had been the child who asked questions. Why did we spend holidays with relatives who made cruel comments? Why did Dad need to approve where Mom volunteered? Why was a B+ in advanced chemistry treated as if it revealed a moral defect? Questions were never welcomed in our house. They were treated as evidence of ingratitude, disrespect, or some flaw in my character that needed correction. I moved out at 23, first for graduate school, then into my own apartment, and eventually into a life that was genuinely mine. Still, I returned for holidays, I called on birthdays, I remained in the family group chat. I maintained the relationship the way someone maintains a house built on a floodplain, carefully, constantly, and with one eye fixed on the weather. 8 months before the birthday dinner, my mother texted me a photograph of their newly redecorated living room. The gallery wall above the fireplace, which had displayed 30 years of family pictures, had been rearranged with new frames. I stared at the image for a long time before I understood what was wrong. Every photograph of me had disappeared. I replied, "It looks beautiful. When did you redo the frames?" My mother answered with a heart emoji. I stared at that little red heart longer than I want to admit. I told myself it was a staging choice. I imagined that she had rotated pictures into other rooms or temporarily taken some down. I told myself many things, because the alternative was too large and painful to examine directly. Looking back, that photograph was the first page of the document my father would eventually place in front of me. During the Uber ride home from the restaurant, the driver kept the radio low and did not try to make conversation. I watched the city move past the window. When I entered my apartment, I placed the envelope on my kitchen table and went to bed without opening it. I lay in the darkness, listening to myself breathe, waiting for the shock to turn into something I could use. By 6 the next morning, it had. I made coffee, positioned the brightest desk lamp I owned over the kitchen table, and photographed every page before handling it further. I made clean images with all 4 corners visible and preserved the timestamps on my phone. Only then did I begin reading. The document was 14 pages long. It had formatted headings, itemized columns, and the letterhead of an actual accounting firm, Pryor Caldwell Financial Associates. It was designed to look official enough that a frightened person might assume there was nothing left to question. I read it once quickly to understand the overall claim. I read it a second time slowly. On the third reading, I stopped being Emily, the daughter who had been ambushed in front of 200 people, and became Emily, the contract's paralegal who examined language and numbers for a living. Problems appeared almost immediately. The claimed rent charges covered years when I was no longer living in my parents' home. Several entries billed me for months, during which I had already been paying rent at my own apartment. A medical charge was dated during my sophomore year of college, when I had full coverage through the university health plan. An education expense ignored part of a scholarship that had paid a portion of the cost. Then I reached page 9. One line listed an $18,400 vehicle contribution for a 2019 Honda Accord. It was the same car Ashley had just claimed as hers. The contradiction was obvious. My parents could not present the car as a financial contribution that I owed them for, while simultaneously claiming they had transferred ownership of that same car to my sister. Both positions could not be true. Either the accounting statement was fraudulent, the alleged title transfer was fraudulent, or both were. I sat with that realization for a moment, then began gathering my own records. On Monday morning, I called Pryor Caldwell Financial Associates. I did not accuse anyone. I did not mention the birthday dinner or the public confrontation. I identified myself by name and asked whether the firm had prepared a family reimbursement statement for Richard and Carol Hartwell. The receptionist became quiet in a way that felt almost physical. A man then came onto the line. His voice was professionally controlled. He asked who I was, and after I repeated my name, he said he could not discuss client records. I thanked him politely and ended the call. His refusal did not prove everything, but his tone told me the firm already understood that the document might become a problem. I recorded the details in my notes. 9:14 a.m. Monday, receptionist transferred the call. Male voice declined to confirm or deny. Then I went to work. A colleague who had recently endured a bitter estate dispute referred me to Margaret O'Day, a civil litigator with 17 years of experience and a reputation for not flinching. Her office smelled like old books and good coffee. On Thursday afternoon, I sat across from her desk and placed all 14 pages in front of her. She opened a yellow legal pad and read without speaking, making occasional notes. When she reached the accounting firm letterhead, her expression changed slightly. The way a doctor's face changes when a scan reveals something unexpected. She looked up and asked, "How many people heard your father say this was money you owed?" I told her close to 200. Then she asked how many people had heard Ashley claim that the title transfer was already complete. I estimated that at least the 6 tables nearest us had heard it, probably 60 or 70 people. "Did you sign anything that night or at any earlier time?" she asked. "No," I said. Margaret wrote the answer down and underlined it. At that moment, my phone lit up on the desk with my father's name. For 30 years, seeing his name had affected my body like a sudden change in weather before my mind could process what was happening. Margaret glanced at the screen and told me to let the call go to voicemail. We waited, then played the message on speaker. Without the restaurant, the audience, and the ritual of straightening his jacket, my father's voice sounded thinner and more controlled. "Emily, this was a family conversation," he said. "Stop acting like it is a legal matter." Margaret stopped writing. She replayed the voicemail twice. Then she said, "He did not call to apologize. He called to rename what he did before you could name it first." She was right. He was trying to establish the vocabulary in advance, to reduce a public financial demand backed by formal-looking paperwork into a private family misunderstanding. Before I could respond, my phone buzzed again. This time it was Ashley. She had sent a photograph of my car sitting in our parents' driveway, with her hand holding the keychain toward the camera. Beneath it she had written, "You should have cried when you had the chance." I turned the screen toward Margaret. For the first time during our meeting, her composure shifted. Her mouth tightened, and she turned her legal pad so I could see 3 words she had written at the top of a clean page. Not family drama. That night, I created a folder on my laptop and named it Q4 Contracts Reference. The name was intentionally boring and administrative, something I could open without feeling as though I were stepping back into the restaurant. Functional organization, I discovered, can be a form of courage. I saved every voicemail with its timestamp, every screenshot with the metadata visible, every page of the envelope document, and every record that contradicted it. I added my scholarship letter, proof of enrollment in the university health plan, my 2016 lease showing when I had moved out, and utility bills establishing that I had maintained a separate residence. Then I began contacting people who had attended the dinner. I did not accuse my family or ask anyone to take my side. I simply asked what they remembered hearing. My cousin Daniel responded within an hour. He said the entire scene had made him sick and that he would repeat exactly what he had heard to anyone who needed to know. His table had been directly beside ours. A longtime family friend named Patricia called me privately. She had known my parents for 20 years and still met my mother for lunch. She was crying slightly when she told me that, near the restrooms before dessert, she had overheard Ashley telling 2 younger cousins that the car was basically handled. That word mattered. Ashley had not said the title had legally transferred or that completed paperwork existed. She had said basically. I recorded Patricia's full name, contact information, the date of our conversation, and her exact recollection. In 6 years of contract work, I had learned that basically could become the most expensive word in an entire case. On Tuesday, Prior Caldwell stopped being silent. A different man called me, smoother and more polished than the first. He explained that the document I had received was not intended as a legal demand. According to him, it was merely a family communication, and the firm hoped there had been no misunderstanding about its purpose. I stayed pleasant and asked him to confirm that explanation in an email. He paused before saying they would prefer to keep the conversation informal. Of course, I replied. I understand completely. As soon as the call ended, I made a voice memo recording the time, date, his name, and the substance of what he had said, then sent it to Margaret. The firm was not merely uncomfortable. It was structurally afraid, the way a professional business becomes afraid when it realizes its letterhead appears on a questionable document that has been photographed, preserved, and delivered to a litigation attorney. Ashley continued longer than anyone else. On Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, she sent steering wheel selfies, photographs of herself in the driver's seat, pictures of my former parking space at our parents' house, laughing emojis, and occasional messages asking how it felt. I never responded. On Thursday, she called 4 times. On Friday, she called 9 times. Saturday passed in silence. Then, on Sunday night, she called 17 times in 4 hours. I sat on my couch eating leftover pasta while my phone repeatedly lit up across the room. Watching it, I felt something shift at a level deeper than anger. For the first time, I understood that Ashley's cruelty had always required an audience. Her behavior had never been entirely about me. It depended on someone watching, reacting, pleading, or crying. By refusing to respond, I had stopped being that audience. Her final voicemail sounded nothing like the woman who had dangled my keys over a restaurant table in front of dozens of witnesses. Her voice was genuinely panicked. Emily, Dad said you are making this official, she said. You cannot do that, okay? The car is mine. He promised me. He told me it was mine. You need to stop whatever you are doing and call me back. Emily, he promised. She never said she had purchased the car. She never said the title was in her name or that she possessed any legal documentation. Her entire claim rested on the fact that our father had promised it to her. I saved the voicemail. At that point, 3 people became central to what happened next, because this was not a story about me defeating my family through willpower alone. It was a story about what happens when someone stops carrying abuse privately and allows the proper institutions to see it. The first person was Margaret O'Day, the civil litigator with the yellow legal pad, who had given me a new vocabulary. The second was Detective Renee Ballard of the Consumer Fraud Division, who agreed to meet after Margaret contacted her. Detective Ballard had 22 years on the force and the energy of someone who had heard every variation of every excuse. She no longer seemed surprised by audacity, but she was still capable of becoming angry on behalf of the person harmed by it. She read the document, listened to the voicemails, and studied the accounting letterhead for a long time. They put their name on this, she finally said. Letterhead and everything, I replied. She slowly shook her head. The third person was James Whitfield, an attorney with 31 years of experience in elder law and fraudulent asset transfers. Margaret referred me to him because she wanted a specific legal question examined: whether the publicly announced but never documented transfer of my car to Ashley could constitute attempted theft or another unlawful use of property. James had such an unbothered manner that drama seemed ridiculous in his presence. He reviewed Ashley's text messages and listened to her voicemail. He paid particular attention to the photograph of my car in our parents' driveway, which Ashley had first posted publicly to her Instagram story and then sent directly to me. The story included a location tag. She posted this publicly? he asked. When I confirmed it, he made a sound that was not quite a laugh and said, "All right, here is what we have." What we had was a 14-page document on professional letterhead demanding $400,000, delivered before a large group of identifiable witnesses, and containing line items that could be proven false. It charged rent for periods when I did not live in my parents' house. It included medical expenses paid by a third-party insurer and education expenses partly covered by scholarships. James described the overall conduct as possible fraudulent misrepresentation of debt. In addition, the document listed the Honda Accord as an $18,400 parental contribution and therefore part of the alleged debt. Yet my father and sister had publicly claimed that the same vehicle had been transferred to Ashley. When we checked with the Department of Motor Vehicles, no such transfer had occurred. The title remained legally in my name. Ashley had been driving a vehicle she did not own. Her Instagram photographs confirmed that she possessed and used it. The geotag information showed where she had driven it. Her own voicemail confirmed that her belief in her ownership came only from a verbal promise made by our father. James picked up his phone and made the kind of call that produces a case number. 4 days after the birthday dinner, my phone began ringing with a different kind of urgency. My father called 7 times that day. My mother called twice, which carried its own significance. She almost never initiated communication about anything uncomfortable, so 2 calls in one afternoon told me that something had changed. Ashley had stopped calling after her 17 attempts on Sunday, which suggested that someone had warned her. The accounting firm was probably beginning to understand the same danger. I answered none of them. On the 5th day, I returned from work and found a handwritten note waiting with the front desk in my apartment building. It was in my mother's handwriting. "Emily, please. This is a family matter. Your father is not well. We need to talk." I photographed the note, added it to the Q4 folder, and forwarded the image to Margaret. I want to be honest about my state of mind during those days. I did not feel triumphant or righteous. Stories like this are often told as though the protagonist experiences one dramatic moment of certainty and becomes fearless. That was not how it felt. I was tired, frightened, and methodical. I completed one small task at a time because small tasks were the only things I could manage. The night I received my mother's note, I sat beside my window for a long time. I remembered being 7 years old and falling from my bicycle in the street. My father had come outside and helped me stand without speaking. At 7, I interpreted that silence as tenderness because I had nothing else with which to compare it. I remembered my mother guiding my hands while teaching me to make pie crust, flour covering the counter. I remembered Ashley at 14 laughing in the backyard at something I had said, genuinely laughing rather than performing for anyone. I thought about all of those memories, because harmful people do not exist in only one frozen version. Then I remembered the young server at the restaurant, holding a pitcher and going perfectly still. Even a stranger had recognized what was happening. Everyone had seen it, and no one had intervened. The world had continued. My father had straightened his jacket, and the room had allowed him to proceed. I finally went to bed because I had a meeting the next morning. The meeting included Margaret, Detective Ballard, and James Whitfield. It was the most professionally surreal 45 minutes of my life. The way formal proceedings often become strange when they are built around your own private pain. Margaret had filed a civil claim. James had submitted a report to the DMV Fraud Division concerning the announced but unprocessed title transfer and had initiated a separate inquiry into Prior Caldwell's potential liability for allowing its letterhead to appear on a fraudulent debt instrument. Detective Ballard had opened a formal consumer fraud investigation. During the previous 4 days, she had contacted Prior Caldwell directly. They responded within 3 hours, she told me. That speed revealed a great deal. The firm had already issued what Detective Ballard described as a complete account reversal. In a formal communication, Prior Caldwell claimed that the document given to me had been only a draft prepared as part of a family estate planning discussion. The firm said it had never been finalized, was not intended as a legal demand, and had been shared prematurely without authorization. That final phrase mattered, without authorization. In other words, either my father had removed a document from the firm before it was approved, or the firm was now trying to distance itself from a document it regretted creating. Either possibility placed him directly in the path of their effort to protect themselves. I asked whether the explanation would hold up. Detective Ballard shrugged slightly and said that was their problem. For my case, the statement actually helped. The professional firm whose name appeared on the demand had officially disavowed it, making my father's claim less legitimate rather than more. James then turned the discussion back to the car. The DMV had confirmed that I remained the titled owner. Ashley had driven the vehicle to at least 3 separate places during 4 days, and her public Instagram posts documented those trips through timestamps and geotags. Her voicemail established that her ownership claim relied on her father's promise, not on a valid transfer. Detective Ballard described that as unauthorized use of a motor vehicle, with the possibility of additional consequences depending on how the district attorney evaluated intent. When I asked how my father fit into that issue, she explained that he had purported to give his younger daughter property he did not fully own or possess the authority to transfer. That created a separate problem for him. Margaret then leaned forward and pointed out what she called the beautiful part of my father's choice of venue. He had chosen an audience. He had assembled nearly 200 credible, named, identifiable people and made his announcement in the most documentable manner possible. He believed their presence would legitimize the demand and magnify my humiliation. He had never considered that the same witnesses could later provide written accounts of exactly what he and Ashley had said. Daniel was not the only person willing to help. 6 other attendees voluntarily submitted statements. They included family, friends, cousins, and one relative who had driven 3 hours to attend and had been horrified by the end of dessert. Patricia gave a detailed account of hearing Ashley say the car was basically handled near the restrooms. My father had wanted witnesses, and he received them. They simply did not work in the direction he expected. What followed was slower and less cinematic than the kind of ending people usually prefer, but it was real. Prior Caldwell Financial Associates settled with me in a separate civil action within 6 weeks. I cannot disclose the amount. I can say that the firm's official disavowal of the document destroyed its relationship with my father, according to information that eventually reached me through Daniel. My father was furious that the firm had abandoned him so quickly. He had apparently believed its employees would stand behind the paperwork and had failed to understand what it meant for their professional name to appear on it. Ashley did not face criminal charges over the car. The district attorney reviewed the evidence and declined prosecution, citing the absence of a sufficiently clear paper trail, proving criminal intent, rather than a genuine misunderstanding about ownership. I disagreed with that decision, although Margaret considered it reasonable given the required evidentiary standard. The car was returned to me 8 days after the DMV inquiry began. A man I did not recognize drove it to my apartment building and left it there with a brief unsigned note. Key under visor. My parents retained an attorney as soon as they learned that formal proceedings had begun. Their lawyer contacted Margaret and described my civil claim as an unfortunate escalation of a private family disagreement. He proposed mediation and a family conversation. Margaret's response was brief. The claim would proceed. I will not describe everything uncovered during discovery, because some of it involved my parents' finances in ways that are theirs to carry. What mattered to my case was that my documentation held up exactly as expected. The scholarship letters proved that part of my education had been paid from another source. The lease and utility records established when I had left my parents' home. The university health records confirmed that the medical expense listed against me had been covered by the student plan. More significantly, 3 line items from the original $400,000 demand had already been charged against a separate family account maintained for another purpose. In other words, my parents' document attempted to count certain expenses twice. The junior accountant who had originally prepared the statement gave a deposition. She was 29 years old and visibly frightened. She explained that my father had supplied the figures and asked her to format them as a family accounting statement. She had questioned 2 entries because they appeared inconsistent, but he assured her that the numbers were correct. She said the document had been treated as final before anyone told her it would be presented in a formal or public setting. She knew nothing about the birthday dinner or the 200 guests. She believed she was preparing material for a private estate planning discussion. When she learned how the document had actually been used, she cried briefly during the deposition. Then she collected herself, looked at me, and said, "I am sorry. I am truly sorry that happened to you." I believed her. 14 weeks after the birthday dinner, the dispute reached a mediated settlement. The agreement included a formal written acknowledgement that the document presented to me was not a valid legal demand, that I did not owe my parents the alleged debt or any debt of that kind, and that the Honda Accord had remained my legal property at all times. It also included payment of my legal fees and an additional financial amount that I placed into savings and rarely think about. The settlement did not include an apology from my father. I want to be transparent about that. I did not request one, and he never offered one. I have spent considerable time thinking about both facts. His attorney used careful procedural language throughout the case, the kind of language chosen by people who have been instructed not to admit fault. I never saw my father again after the restaurant. I do not know what his face looked like when members of the audience he had gathered to witness my humiliation began providing statements to my lawyer instead. Sometimes I imagine him straightening his jacket. I imagine that, for once, the gesture did not help. My mother sent one email directly from her personal account, bypassing both attorneys. Margaret told me I did not have to read it, but I chose to. The message contained 3 paragraphs. In the first, my mother said she loved me. In the second, she explained, unconvincingly, that the dinner had been Richard's idea and had gone further than she had understood or agreed to. In the third, she asked whether we could have lunch. I have not answered. I do not know whether I ever will. That is not a declaration of victory. It is simply where I am. 9 months have passed since the dinner. I have my car back. At the first service appointment, I learned that it needed new brake pads. The metaphor was so obvious that I laughed aloud in the waiting room, and the service advisor looked at me with concern. The Q4 contracts reference folder remains on my laptop, but I have not opened it in 6 weeks. That feels important. I still live in an apartment that is mine in every possible way. My name on the lease, my belongings in the rooms, and photographs on the walls that include me. No one can quietly remove me from my own home. I learned lessons from what happened that I will carry for the rest of my life. People who need an audience for their worst behavior understand, at least somewhere inside themselves, that witnesses matter. What they often miscalculate is the direction in which those witnesses may eventually work. A document created in bad faith can still become powerful evidence, just not the evidence its creator intended. I also learned that being methodical during a crisis has a hidden cost. Methodical people do not always have the public collapse that would make everyone recognize the depth of the injury. Instead, they photograph the pages, preserve the metadata, make the calls, organize the folder, and appear functional. They remain professionally and persistently fine until, slowly, fine becomes real. A boring folder name can be more than a small detail. Sometimes it is the structure that allows a person to keep moving. On the 9-month anniversary of the birthday dinner, I went alone to a good restaurant. It was not the same restaurant. I ordered the 3-course menu and chose both dessert and coffee, the part of my birthday meal that had been interrupted before I could enjoy it. My server was probably 22. He was friendly and had no idea that I was celebrating anything. I did not explain. Some victories are quiet. Some justice remains private. Some of the most important things a person ever does happen in rooms where no one applauds. My father had stood before 200 people and placed an envelope on the table as though it were the final word about my life. It was not. He forgot, or perhaps never understood, that if you spend 30 years raising someone who knows how to read the fine print, you eventually teach her exactly what to do when you hand her the evidence.